If you all are on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it and hope you enjoy my videos. Thank you. So let's do it. The most horror story. The Forest of Skulls. Deep in the heart of a forgotten land lay a forest that no map dared to mark. Locals called it the Forest of Skulls, a cursed place whispered about in hushed tones. They said no one who entered ever returned, except for their screams, which echoed in the dead of night. Elena was a journalist with a reputation for chasing the unexplainable. When she heard the stories of the Forest of Skulls, she knew she had to investigate. Armed with her camera, flashlight, and recorder, she set off alone, ignoring the warnings of terrified villagers. As Elena stepped into the forest, an eerie silence fell around her. The trees seemed to bend toward her, their skeletal branches clawing at the air. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like sinister figures in the mist. And then she saw them. Skulls. Hundreds of them. They weren't just lying on the ground. They were embedded in the trees, their hollow eyes staring out at her. Some were human, others, not. The bark of the trees seemed to grow around the skulls, trapping them in eternal agony. Suddenly, Elena heard a whisper. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping and echoing as though the forest itself was speaking. "Leave," the voices hissed. "Or join us." Her heart raced as the whispers grew louder, forming incomprehensible chants. She turned to run, but the path she had entered on was gone. The forest had shifted, its twisted roots and gnarled branches creating a labyrinth. Elena's flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging her into darkness. But in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, she saw movement. Figures, pale and skeletal, were emerging from the shadows. She stumbled backward, her camera snapping involuntarily, capturing fleeting glimpses of the horrors closing in. One figure stepped closer. It was a man, or what remained of him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his voice a rasping whisper. "You took what didn't belong to you," he said. Elena froze. She didn't understand, but then she remembered. The skull-shaped pendant she had found on the forest floor when she first entered. She pulled it out of her pocket, her hands trembling. "Take it," she screamed, throwing it toward the figure. For a moment, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the figures froze, and the air grew unnaturally still. But then the forest roared in fury. The ground beneath Elena cracked open, and skeletal hands reached out, pulling her down into the earth. Her screams echoed into the night, joining the countless others that haunted the Forest of Skulls. The next morning, her camera was found at the edge of the forest, its memory card filled with chilling images of the skulls, the figures, and her final moments. No one dared to enter to recover her body. And the whispers began again. The Forest of Skulls. Part 2: The Cursed Legacy. Months passed since Elena's disappearance, but her story became a legend, whispered across villages and newsrooms alike. Among those drawn to the tale was her younger brother, Daniel. Unlike the villagers, Daniel didn't fear the forest. He was determined to uncover the truth and find his sister, alive or dead. Armed with a backpack full of survival gear and Elena's recovered camera, Daniel ventured into the Forest of Skulls under the pale light of a full moon. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the same haunting silence surrounded him as he stepped into the cursed woods. This time, the forest felt alive, watching him. The skulls embedded in the trees seemed to follow his every move, their hollow sockets filled with an unnatural awareness. Daniel stopped to inspect the camera's photos. One image caught his attention, a blurry shot of a strange symbol etched into the bark of a tree. Beneath the symbol, there was something written in an ancient language. He scanned his surroundings and, after hours of searching, found the very tree in the photo. The symbol glowed faintly as if beckoning him. Without thinking, Daniel traced it with his fingers. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the forest. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. Daniel turned, but there was no one. Shadows began to slither between the trees, taking human-like forms. One figure stepped forward. It was Elena, or at least, what was left of her. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, and her voice was an eerie echo of the sister he once knew. "Daniel, you shouldn't have come," she said, her tone filled with both warning and sorrow. "I came to save you," Daniel replied, his voice trembling. "You can't save me. I belong to the forest now," Elena whispered, stepping closer. "But you might escape, if you do exactly as I say." Before Daniel could respond, the shadows surged forward, surrounding him in a swirling mass of darkness. Elena shouted something incomprehensible, and the shadows froze. She handed him a small bone-carved dagger, its blade etched with the same glowing symbols he had seen on the tree. "Destroy the heart of the forest," she instructed, pointing toward a faint, pulsating red glow deep within the woods. "It's the only way to break the curse. But beware, the forest will fight back." Without hesitation, Daniel ran toward the glow. The forest came alive, its roots and branches lashing out, trying to stop him. The skulls began to scream, a deafening cacophony of agony and rage. Finally, he reached the source of the glow, a massive, ancient tree with a grotesque, beating heart at its core. Daniel raised the dagger, but before he could strike, the shadows coalesced into a monstrous form, blocking his path. The creature spoke in a voice that shook the earth. "If you destroy the heart, you destroy her." Daniel hesitated, his grip faltering. "Elena, is this true?" From behind him, Elena's voice echoed, faint and distant. "Do it, Daniel. Free me, free us all." With tears streaming down his face, Daniel plunged the dagger into the heart. The forest let out a deafening wail as the tree and its heart disintegrated into ash. The skulls crumbled, the shadows dissipated, and the forest began to collapse in on itself. Daniel barely escaped the implosion, stumbling out of the woods just as dawn broke. In his hands was Elena's locket, the only remnant of his sister. The forest of skulls was no more, but its curse and the memories of those lost to it would haunt him forever. The Forest of Skulls. Part 3: The Eternal Shadow. Daniel thought it was over. The Forest of Skulls was destroyed, and the villagers no longer whispered about its horrors. But deep inside, Daniel knew something wasn't right. Nightmares plagued him. Visions of Elena's pale, hollow face and the haunting whispers of the forest. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the locket he had taken from the forest began to hum faintly. A chill filled the room, and a voice, soft, yet bone-chilling, whispered his name. Daniel. He froze. It was Elena's voice, but it wasn't comforting. It was hollow, laced with an unnatural echo. The lights flickered, and his reflection in the nearby mirror warped. Behind him stood a shadowy figure, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes burning red. "You destroyed the heart," the figure rasped. "But the curse isn't broken, it's unleashed." Before Daniel could react, the room dissolved around him. He found himself standing in a dark, desolate version of his apartment, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols he had seen in the forest. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and faint whispers echoed from every corner. The shadowy figure loomed closer. The heart was not the forest's core, it was its prison. "You set it free." Daniel's chest tightened as the realization sank in. By destroying the heart, he had unleashed an ancient entity bound to the forest, a being older than time itself. Suddenly, the locket in his hand grew unbearably hot, burning his skin. He dropped it, and as it hit the ground, it cracked open, releasing a dense black mist that filled the room. From the mist emerged Elena, her face twisted in torment. "Run," she screamed. "It's coming for you." The walls of the apartment began to bleed, dark red streaks running down like rivers. The whispers grew into deafening screams, and grotesque, skeletal figures began clawing their way out of the shadows. Daniel ran, but the apartment had transformed into an endless maze. Every door he opened led him back to the same room, now filled with writhing shadows and disembodied hands reaching for him. In the center of the room stood the entity, a towering, skeletal figure cloaked in darkness, its bony fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. Its voice was a guttural growl, resonating deep within Daniel's chest. "You cannot escape, Daniel. You are marked. The curse is eternal." Desperate, Daniel remembered the dagger from the forest. He didn't have it, but he noticed a shard of the locket on the ground, still glowing faintly. Grabbing it, he lunged at the entity, stabbing it in the chest. The creature let out an earth-shattering roar as its form began to disintegrate. But as it faded, its eyes locked onto Daniel. "You may destroy me," it hissed, "but the curse will find another." The shadow always returns. The apartment shattered like glass, and Daniel found himself back in his room, the locket reduced to ashes in his hand. The air was still, but the silence was unnerving. He looked around, expecting the nightmare to resume. Weeks passed, and nothing happened. Daniel tried to convince himself it was over, but the shadows in his room seemed darker than before. The faintest whispers lingered at the edge of his hearing. One night, as he drifted to sleep, a cold hand touched his shoulder. His eyes snapped open, and he saw Elena standing at the foot of his bed, her face devoid of emotion. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice now void of life. "It's your turn." The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Daniel's screams echoed through the night, but no one ever heard them. When the neighbors broke down his door the next morning, the apartment was empty, except for a single skull resting on his bed. The curse had claimed its next victim. The Forest of Skulls. Part 4. The final truth. There are places in the world where darkness is not the absence of light but the presence of something older, something alive. The Forest of Skulls was one of those places, a wound in the earth that festered with secrets humanity was never meant to uncover. Elena's disappearance, Daniel's futile quest, and the horrors that followed were not the beginning nor the end. They were mere echoes in a cycle that had repeated for centuries. The forest did not die when Daniel destroyed the heart, it merely transformed. The curse, no longer tethered to the land, became a shadow that seeped into the world, infecting the air, the soil, and the minds of those who dared to remember. Elena was gone, her soul consumed by the forest long before Daniel arrived. Her appearances, her warnings, and her pleas for help were never truly hers. The forest had used her, just as it had used countless others before her, weaving them into its story to lure the next victim. Daniel's final act of defiance did not save him. It did not save anyone. The entity that emerged from the forest's heart was not bound to a single form or place. It thrived on fear, feeding on the lives and memories of those who came too close. Now, it resides everywhere and nowhere. The shadows that linger too long in your room, the whispers that brush against your ear in an empty house, the feeling of being watched in the dead of night, all are remnants of the Forest of Skulls. There is no escaping it, no defeating it, because it does not seek to harm. It seeks to endure, and it endures through you, through your thoughts, and through the stories you tell. So, if you ever hear about the Forest of Skulls or see its symbols etched in unexpected places, do not investigate. Do not speak its name aloud. For the more you remember, the closer it comes. And once it finds you, there is no turning back. The Forest of Skulls was never just a place. It was an idea, a living, breathing curse. And ideas, once unleashed, can never truly die. Sure, here's a spooky and eerie story set in the USA, with a dark, mysterious atmosphere. The Whispering Pines. It was a cold, moonless night in the small town of Ashford, nestled deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their dark branches creaking in the wind. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the forest, calling it the Whispering Pines, but no one really knew why. Lena had moved to Ashford only a few months ago, seeking the quiet life of a small town away from the bustle of city living. She rented a small cabin on the edge of the forest, far from the town's center. The land had been cheap, and she was desperate to escape her troubled past. However, as the days passed, she began to feel an unsettling presence around her. One evening, while sitting by her fireplace, Lena heard it, a soft whisper, faint but distinct, calling her name from the woods. Lena, Lena. The voice was chilling, yet strangely familiar, as if it knew her deepest secrets. She shook it off as the wind or perhaps a trick of the mind, but the whispers came every night, growing louder, more insistent. One particularly cold night, Her curiosity overtook her fear. She bundled up and stepped outside, following the whispers into the forest. The air was thick with fog, and the trees felt oppressive, as though they were closing in around her. The wind howled, carrying the whispers with it. As she ventured deeper, the world around her seemed to warp and distort. The ground felt spongy beneath her boots, as though she were walking on a surface not quite real. After what felt like hours, she stumbled upon an old, decaying cabin hidden among the trees. Its wooden walls were blackened, and the roof sagged as though it could collapse at any moment. The door creaked open on its own, inviting her inside. With a mix of dread and intrigue, Lena stepped into the dark, musty room. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw the shadows move. Figures, hunched and ghostly, circled the room, their faces obscured by dark hoods. They were whispering, chanting in an ancient tongue. And then, from the far corner, a figure emerged, tall, with hollow, glowing eyes. Its skin was as pale as the moon, and its voice echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't have come here, Lena," it said in a voice that made her bones rattle. "The forest has claimed many souls before you, and now it claims yours." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the shadows began to close in around her, their whispers turning into a deafening chorus. The figure reached out with a cold, skeletal hand, and Lena screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, the townspeople found her cabin empty. The whispers in the woods were gone, but the trees had grown even darker, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. And in the distance, the faintest sound of a woman's voice calling her name could still be heard in the wind. "Lena, Lena." This eerie tale from the woods of Ashford captures the unsettling, ghostly presence of an ancient force lurking in the forest. The return of Lena. Months passed since Lena's disappearance. The town of Ashford had grown quiet, with people speaking less and less about the eerie events that had unfolded. The local authorities had never found any trace of her, and the whispers in the woods had faded. Life slowly returned to normal, but something in the air felt different, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. One chilly autumn evening, a young couple, Sarah and Daniel, decided to take a weekend getaway to Ashford. They had heard of the small town's charm, its quiet nature, and its proximity to the famed Whispering Pines. Curious about the old legends, they decided to rent the very same cabin where Lena had once lived. Upon arrival, they were immediately struck by the strange atmosphere. The cabin stood isolated at the edge of the forest, its windows dark and foreboding. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but Daniel laughed it off, claiming it was just the isolation that gave the place an eerie feel. They settled in and started a fire, trying to shake off the unease that seemed to cling to the air. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of wind rushing through the trees. The howling wind seemed to be whispering something faint but insistent. Sarah tried to ignore it, but as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, and soon, she could hear her name among the wind. "Sarah, Sarah." Her heart began to race. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel, sitting by the fire, glanced up, his expression shifting as he heard it too. It was the same voice that had called to Lena, the same haunting tone that echoed through the forest. "It's just the wind," Daniel reassured her, but his voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, the temperature in the cabin dropped. Their breath turned to fog in the air. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Sarah looked out of the window, her eyes widening in horror. In the distance, a pale figure emerged from the fog. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her hair long and wild. Her face was pale, hollow, and her eyes, black as coal, stared directly at Sarah with an unnatural intensity. "Who's there?" Daniel shouted, but the figure did not respond. It just stood there, watching them, its form flickering in and out of the fog like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Then, without warning, the figure began to move, slowly advancing towards the cabin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Sarah's fear turned to panic. "We need to leave now," she screamed, but as she reached for the door, the figure disappeared, only to reappear in front of the cabin. It reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers scraping across the glass of the window. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The figure's mouth opened, and a voice, cold and chilling, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come back." Daniel tried to pull Sarah away from the window, but before they could react, the cabin door creaked open on its own. The air turned frigid as the figure stepped inside, its hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. "Lena never left," it whispered, "and now, neither will you." The wind howled through the room, and the shadows twisted, reaching out like tendrils, pulling Sarah and Daniel into the darkness. In that moment, their screams were swallowed by the forest, and the town of Ashford was once again left in silence. The next morning, the cabin stood empty. There was no sign of Sarah or Daniel, only the faintest trace of footprints leading into the forest, disappearing into the mist. The locals knew the forest had claimed them too, just as it had claimed Lena. And the whispers in the wind. They never stopped, now calling out the names of anyone who dared to venture too close to the Whispering Pines. This continuation adds to the mystery and terror of the Whispering Pines, showing how the forest's malevolent force continues to claim victims. The Whispering Pines. In the remote town of Ashford, nestled in the dense, foggy forests of the Pacific Northwest, there existed a place locals never dared approach, the Whispering Pines. The dense woods stretched for miles, the trees twisted and blackened, as though something evil had once taken root in the earth beneath them. It was said that the forest was cursed, and that no one who entered ever came out the same, or at all. Lena had come to Ashford looking for peace. After a troubled past, she sought solitude in the small town, far away from the city's chaos. She found a small cabin on the outskirts of town, tucked at the edge of the forest. The rent was cheap, and the air was thick with mystery. But that very mystery was what started to gnaw at her sanity. It wasn't long before Lena heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind shifting through the trees. But soon, they were unmistakable, soft, chilling voices calling her name. "Lena, Lena." The whispers grew louder each night, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore them, they seeped into her dreams. Her mind began to unravel as she found herself drawn to the woods, compelled by an unseen force. One night, the pull became too strong. Lena put on her coat, stepping into the cold night air. The fog was thick, and the trees around her seemed to reach for her, their twisted branches creaking in the wind. As she ventured deeper into the forest, the whispers turned to voices, and she swore she could hear them speaking to her directly. "Lena, come closer." The path she walked grew darker, the trees now nearly suffocating her in their endless rows. She finally came upon a decaying cabin, hidden from the world, its rotting walls barely standing. The door creaked open of its own accord as if inviting her in. Lena hesitated but couldn't stop herself. She stepped inside. The air was stale, and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Shadows moved against the walls, and figures, hunched and indistinct, whispered in a language Lena could not understand. And then, from the far corner, a figure appeared, tall, gaunt, its eyes black and lifeless, a voice that resonated in her very soul. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice like ice. "The forest is hungry. You are already one of us." Before Lena could react, the darkness surged. Cold, skeletal hands reached out, dragging her into the shadows. Her scream was lost in the wind, and the forest fell silent. The town searched for Lena, but she was never found. The whispers of the forest faded for a time, and life in Ashford moved on, though the tension in the air grew heavier with each passing day. Months later, a young couple, Sarah and Daniel, arrived in Ashford. Seeking a weekend getaway, they rented the same cabin where Lena had disappeared. They were told of the strange history of the town, but they dismissed it as nothing more than local superstition. The cabin was isolated, but the surrounding beauty made it worth the eerie feeling that clung to the air. That night, the whispers began. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night wore on, the voices grew louder, clearer. "Sarah, Sarah." The air grew colder, and the fire flickered as though something unseen was watching them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel tried to reassure her, but then, a pale figure appeared in the window. Its hair was wild, its face an empty void, and its eyes were dark, endless pits. "Who are you?" Daniel shouted, but the figure did not answer. It only stared, its gaze piercing them both. The figure stepped closer, vanishing from sight and reappearing at the door. It stood motionless, its long fingers scraping against the wood. "You should not have come here," it whispered, its voice like the wind, yet somehow deep in their minds. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, and the fire went out completely. The figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, its hollow eyes locked on Sarah. Before they could react, the door creaked open by itself, and the figure stepped inside, its presence suffocating. It was no longer just a vision, it was real. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, taking shape, whispering in an ancient language. "You are not welcome here," the figure said, its voice now unmistakably Lena's. The room twisted, warping as the shadows reached out to grab them. The wind howled, and the whispers filled their minds. They tried to flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figure's hollow eyes bore into them as the darkness closed in, its voice now a chorus of tortured souls. "You are ours, forever." By morning, the cabin was empty. There were no signs of Sarah or Daniel, only their footprints leading into the dense fog of the forest. The locals knew what had happened. They had been claimed by the Whispering Pines, just as Lena had. And now, the whispers in the woods were even louder, calling the names of those brave, or foolish, enough to enter. The town of Ashford fell into a silence even deeper than before. The forest had grown even darker, and the trees seemed to whisper at all hours. And to anyone who ventured too close, the forest would call out their name, just as it had called Lena's, Sarah's, and Daniel's, waiting for the next soul to fall under its twisted spell. This version enhances the horror, combining the eerie atmosphere with a sense of inevitability and doom. The haunting presence of the Whispering Pines is even more powerful, ensuring a chilling experience for anyone reading it. The Whispering Pines, in the remote town of Ashford, nestled deep within the mist-covered forests of the Pacific Northwest, there was one place that everyone in town feared, the Whispering Pines. Locals would never speak of it openly, but they whispered in hushed tones that the woods were cursed, a place where spirits never rested and the trees themselves seemed to hunger for the souls of the living. Lena had sought solace in Ashford, escaping the chaos of her past. She rented a cabin on the edge of the woods, a lonely place, surrounded by dark, twisted trees. The rent was cheap, but the air was thick with an unsettling energy. She tried to ignore the sense of dread that clung to the cabin, but it was only a matter of time before the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, a breeze shifting through the trees, or so she thought. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. At night, they called her name, soft and distant at first, but then sharp and insistent. "Lena, Lena." The wind seemed to carry her name through the forest, but it was not the wind, it was something else, something old, ancient. One night, unable to ignore the pull any longer, Lena stepped outside into the cold fog. The forest seemed to move with a life of its own, the trees twisting in unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like fingers. The whispers surrounded her, beckoning her deeper into the woods. "Come closer. Lena, you must come." She found herself drawn to a decaying cabin hidden among the trees. Its wooden walls were blackened with age, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. As she stepped inside, the air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to move, whispering in an ancient language she couldn't understand. There, standing in the corner, was a figure, a tall, gaunt woman with eyes as black as the void. Her voice, cold and unfeeling, echoed in Lena's mind. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered. "You are already one of us." Before Lena could react, the darkness enveloped her. Cold, skeletal hands reached out, pulling her into the shadows. Her scream was swallowed by the wind, and the forest fell silent. Months later, the town spoke little of Lena. But those who dared to walk the forest at night would tell of the strange sightings, shadows moving on their own, whispers on the wind, and the occasional glimpse of a pale woman with hollow eyes, always standing just beyond the tree line. Sarah and Daniel, a young couple seeking a weekend getaway, arrived in Ashford, unaware of its dark history. They rented the same cabin where Lena had disappeared, and though they felt an odd chill in the air, they brushed it off as nothing more than superstition. But when night fell, the whispers began. "Sarah, Sarah." The wind carried the voices through the trees, and the temperature in the cabin dropped sharply. Sarah shuddered, looking to Daniel for comfort, but he, too, could hear it now. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice faltered. They looked out the window, and there, standing in the fog, was a figure, pale, disheveled, her eyes dark pits staring right at them. She didn't move, but her presence filled the cabin with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the figure was gone, only to reappear at the door, scratching its long, bony fingers across the wood. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered. The voice sent a chill down their spines. It was Lena's voice. The air grew frigid, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch toward them, twisting and reaching. The door creaked open on its own, and the figure stepped inside, her eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. "You are not welcome here," she hissed. "The forest claims all who enter. And now, you belong to it." Before Sarah and Daniel could run, the shadows surged, engulfing them both. The darkness swallowed them whole, and their screams were muffled by the wind as the forest claimed yet another pair of souls. The next morning, the cabin stood empty, the door ajar, as if they had never been there. The townspeople searched for Sarah and Daniel but found only faint footprints leading into the woods, vanishing into the fog. The locals knew the forest had taken them, just as it had taken Lena. The forest grew darker still. The trees seemed to grow thicker, the whispers louder, and the fog thicker. And in the distance, those who dared to venture too close to the whispering pines would hear the voices, names long forgotten, pleading for help, begging for release. But no one would ever answer, for the forest had claimed them all, and the whispering pines stood tall, forever hungry, waiting for the next soul to fall under its twisted spell. In this version, the presence of the spirits becomes stronger, blending the ghosts of those lost into the forest itself, creating a sense of an all-encompassing evil. It heightens the feeling of doom, where the woods are not just haunted, they are alive, constantly searching for the next soul to claim. The end of the Whispering Pines. Years had passed since the last disappearance in Ashford, and the town had slowly begun to forget the legends that had haunted them for so long. But the Whispering Pines, the dark forest on the outskirts of town, still whispered in the wind, and the residents knew better than to venture too close. The stories of Lena, Sarah, and Daniel had become nothing more than hushed whispers among the few who dared speak of them. But deep within the woods, something had changed. Catherine, a determined and fearless paranormal investigator, arrived in Ashford. She had heard the stories of the spirits that haunted the Whispering Pines, of the cursed forest that consumed the souls of anyone foolish enough to enter. But Catherine was different. She had faced dark forces before, and she was certain she could bring an end to the terror that had plagued the town for decades. She began her investigation by speaking to the locals. The elders spoke with quiet fear of the forest, warning her to stay away. But Catherine, unwavering in her resolve, gathered what little information she could about the history of the Whispering Pines. There were rumors of an ancient ritual, of a powerful curse that had been cast long ago, binding the spirits of the forest to the land, ensuring they would never rest. She learned of the cabin where Lena, Sarah, and Daniel had vanished, and knew that this was where the source of the darkness lay. Catherine prepared herself, gathering ancient texts, salt, holy water, and relics from her many years of work in the supernatural field. She ventured into the forest at dusk, the fog thick and suffocating, the trees like dark sentinels watching her every move. The whispers began almost immediately, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. "Catherine, Catherine." The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of the forest pressed against her chest. She followed the faint trail to the decaying cabin, where the darkness seemed to pulse, waiting. As she stepped inside, she felt the energy shift. This was no ordinary haunting. The spirits of the forest were bound by a powerful curse, and they would not be easily freed. In the center of the cabin, the shadows twisted, and there, before her, stood the figure of Lena, her hollow eyes dark as coal, her form flickering like a flame on the brink of extinction. "You should not have come," Lena's voice echoed, a chorus of tortured souls ringing in her ears. Catherine stood her ground, her voice steady. "I'm not here to leave. I'm here to end this." With a wave of her hand, Catherine invoked the ancient rites she had learned. She scattered salt around the room, her words ringing in the air like a chant. The darkness stirred, the spirits writhing in agony as the ritual began to take hold. The air grew thick with malevolent energy as the spirits of the lost souls screamed in pain, their voices merging with the wind. Lena's form twisted, her face contorted in rage. "You cannot stop us. We are the forest, and the forest will never be free." But Catherine's resolve was unshakable. She held up a relic, a pendant forged from holy silver, and invoked the final words of the ritual. A bright light flared from the pendant, bathing the cabin in a blinding glow. The spirits screamed as the light pierced the darkness, and the ground beneath them trembled. The forest itself seemed to roar in agony as the curse began to unravel. The trees shook violently, their twisted branches snapping as if they were breaking free from an unseen force. The dark energy that had bound the spirits to the land began to dissolve, and one by one, the lost souls were released. Lena's form faltered, her features twisting in agony before she finally dissipated into the air like smoke. The other spirits, Sarah, Daniel, and the countless others who had vanished into the forest over the years, followed suit, their anguished cries fading into silence. As the light of the pendant dimmed, the fog lifted, and the forest, once dark and suffocating, began to return to a peaceful calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over the land for so long was gone. The Whispering Pines, once a place of death and terror, was now just another part of the forest, free from the curse that had bound it for centuries. Catherine stood in the clearing, breathing deeply as the last remnants of the darkness faded away. The spirits were free, and the Whispering Pines were no longer a place of fear. Ashford would finally be able to move on, the horrors of the past erased by the strength of one determined woman. As she made her way back to the town, Catherine knew that her work was done. The ghosts were gone, and the forest would no longer claim the lives of the innocent. The Whispering Pines had been silenced, its hunger for souls finally ended. And Ashford, forever changed, could now breathe a sigh of relief. In this version, the spirits and curse are broken by a powerful investigator who uses ancient rituals to defeat the darkness that has haunted the Whispering Pines for so long. The ghosts of Lena, Sarah, Daniel, and all the others are freed, and the forest is finally at peace, bringing an end to the terror.
If you all are on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it and hope you enjoy my videos. Thank you. So let's do it. The Most Horror Story. Part 1. The Haunting Shadows of Redwood Forest. Deep in the heart of the sprawling Redwood Forest, an eerie legend whispered among locals kept visitors at bay. The forest was said to be cursed, its shadows hiding secrets darker than the night itself. People who ventured too far often vanished, leaving behind only torn belongings and chilling echoes of their screams. One cold December night, a group of 5 adventurous friends decided to uncover the truth. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they entered the dense forest, dismissing the tales as mere folklore. The towering trees loomed over them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. Hours into their journey, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. The air grew colder as they pushed the creaking door open. Inside, the walls were covered with cryptic symbols, and a single chair sat in the center of the room. On the floor was a dusty diary. Claire, the bravest of the group, picked it up and began to read aloud. The diary belonged to a ranger who had gone missing decades ago. His entries spoke of hearing whispers, seeing figures darting between trees, and feeling an unshakable sense of dread. The last entry read, "They are watching. They don't let anyone leave. If you find this, run." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the windows fogged up with icy breath. Shadows began to move, forming grotesque shapes. The friends tried to escape, but the cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, trapping them inside. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, their screams echoing through the forest. By morning, the cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. The forest remained silent, its ancient trees guarding the secrets of the lost souls who dared to enter. To this day, hikers in the redwood forest claim to hear faint screams and see flickering lights in the distance. But no one who follows them ever returns. The curse of the redwood forest. Weeks passed since the disappearance of the 5 friends in Redwood Forest. The local sheriff's department organized a search party, but all they found were abandoned flashlights and the torn remains of the diary. News of the incident spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of paranormal investigator Evelyn Harper, who had spent her career unraveling unsolved mysteries. Evelyn arrived in the small town near Redwood Forest with her team of 3: Sam, a tech expert, Lucas, a historian, and Mia, a psychic. The townsfolk warned them to stay away, but Evelyn's determination was unshakable. She believed the forest held more than just legends, it was a portal to something sinister. As the team ventured into the forest, Mia immediately felt an oppressive energy. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sam set up his equipment, scanning for electromagnetic activity, while Lucas studied the symbols they discovered carved into the trees. The symbols matched ancient markings linked to a long-forgotten cult that worshipped a shadow deity known as Umbra. Deeper into the forest, they found a clearing with a strange, blackened tree at its center. The ground around it was scorched, yet the tree itself seemed alive, pulsating faintly. Mia gasped. "This is the source. This is where they were taken." Before they could react, the shadows began to shift. Dark figures emerged, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The air grew heavy, and the team's flashlights flickered. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the forest, speaking in a language none of them understood. Suddenly, the blackened tree split open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. Evelyn shouted for everyone to run. But it was too late. The shadows lunged at them, pulling Lucas into the vortex. His screams faded as the portal closed, leaving nothing but silence. Evelyn, Sam, and Mia stumbled back to the town at dawn, shaken and broken. They had lost Lucas, and the forest had claimed yet another soul. Evelyn vowed to return, determined to destroy the entity and end the curse of Redwood Forest once and for all. But the forest had other plans. That night, Evelyn woke to the sound of whispers and saw shadows dancing on her bedroom walls. The curse had followed her home. The Silent Grove. In the desolate heart of Oregon, there lay a forest known as Silent Grove. For centuries, the forest had been untouched by man, a sprawling wilderness shrouded in mystery. Locals spoke in hushed tones about its eerie stillness: no birdsong, no rustling leaves, only an oppressive silence that seemed to devour sound itself. 3 college friends, Mark, Rachel, and Ethan, decided to explore the forest, intrigued by its sinister reputation. Armed with camping gear and curiosity, they ignored the warnings of the townsfolk and ventured into Silent Grove on a crisp autumn morning. At first, the forest seemed unremarkable, with towering pines and a thick carpet of moss. But as they moved deeper, an unnatural stillness set in. The air grew cold, and even their footsteps seemed muffled. Rachel tried to laugh off the unease. "It's just a forest," she said, but her voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. By nightfall, they set up camp near a clearing where an ancient, moss-covered stone circle stood. The stones bore strange, angular carvings that Ethan, a history major, couldn't identify. "These look older than anything I've studied," he murmured, running his fingers over the markings. As they settled in for the night, a low, rhythmic thumping began, faint but unmistakable. Mark grabbed a flashlight and scanned the darkness, but there was nothing there. The thumping grew louder, and Rachel screamed as shadowy figures began to emerge between the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct. The shadows circled the campsite, moving closer with each pass. Ethan yelled, "Stay inside the circle." But it was too late. Mark panicked and ran into the forest, his flashlight beam darting wildly. The shadows followed, and his screams echoed briefly before fading into the silence. The remaining 2 huddled together, too terrified to move. The night stretched on endlessly, the shadows watching from just beyond the circle. At dawn, the shadows dissolved, and the forest returned to its oppressive stillness. Rachel and Ethan fled, leaving their gear behind. When they reached the edge of the forest, they found no sign of Mark or the circle of stones. The forest had swallowed them whole. Years later, hikers claim to hear faint thumping sounds deep within Silent Grove. Some swear they've seen shadowy figures moving among the trees. But no one has ever found the ancient stone circle or any trace of Mark. Silent Grove remains a place of mystery, its secrets buried in the unbroken silence of the forest. CL The Cursed Heart of Blackwood Forest. In the remote wilderness of Montana, Blackwood Forest stood as a foreboding expanse of towering trees and impenetrable darkness. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed. Legends spoke of the forest as a place where reality bent and time stood still, swallowing anyone who dared enter. One chilly November evening, 4 thrill seekers, Daniel, Claire, Victor, and Emily, arrived at the edge of Blackwood. They had heard tales of a mysterious stone altar hidden deep within, said to be the heart of the forest's curse. A cursed altar, Victor scoffed. It's just folklore. But Emily, the most cautious of the group, hesitated. Some stories exist. For a reason, she warned. Ignoring her unease, they entered the forest armed with flashlights and a GPS. Almost immediately, something felt off. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Their footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should, and the air grew colder with every step. Hours later, they stumbled upon the stone altar in a small clearing. The structure was ancient, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. Around it, skeletal trees bent unnaturally, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. As Claire reached out to touch the altar, Emily grabbed her arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Victor, laughing nervously, placed his hand on the cold stone. The moment he did, the ground shuddered, and a low, guttural growl resonated through the forest. Shadows began to ripple across the clearing, growing darker and denser. "We need to leave, now," Daniel shouted, but their GPS showed them spinning in circles, unable to find their way back. The forest seemed alive, its trees shifting and closing in around them. Strange whispers echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Emily clutched her flashlight, its beam flickering erratically. "Something's following us," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rising sound of snapping branches. Suddenly, Victor screamed as a shadowy figure lunged from the darkness, dragging him into the trees. His cries were abruptly cut off, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. Claire sobbed, clutching Daniel's arm as Emily tried to keep them moving forward. But the forest seemed endless, every path leading them back to the cursed altar. By the second night, exhaustion set in. The whispers became voices, calling each of them by name. The shadows no longer lurked at the edges, they reached out, brushing against them like icy tendrils. Claire fell to her knees, her mind unraveling as the voices taunted her with secrets only she knew. She begged them to stop, but they only laughed. In the early hours of the third night, Emily woke to find herself alone. Daniel and Claire were gone, their sleeping bags empty. The whispers were louder now, forming words she could understand. "You are the last. The forest will take you." Desperate, Emily ran, her flashlight dying as she stumbled through the darkness. She reached the altar once more, now glowing with a sinister red light. Around it, the shadows danced, and the faces of her friends stared back at her, their expressions frozen in terror. With no way out, Emily fell to her knees, screaming as the shadows closed in. Her cries echoed through the forest before fading into silence. Blackwood Forest reclaimed its secrets that night. The search parties that ventured in found no trace of the four friends, only their abandoned car at the forest's edge. To this day, hikers who stray too close to Blackwood claim to hear faint whispers and see glowing red light deep within the trees. But no one dares venture far enough to discover what truly lies at the heart of the cursed forest. The Cursed Heart of Blackwood Forest, Part 2. Months had passed since the disappearance of Daniel, Claire, Victor, and Emily in Blackwood Forest. The case had gone cold, but the whispers surrounding the forest only grew louder. Stories of hikers vanishing and eerie red lights flickering through the trees drew the attention of Dr. Evelyn Cross, a renowned paranormal investigator. She had read the reports and studied the legends. This was not just another haunting, it was something ancient and far more dangerous. Evelyn assembled a team: Marcus, a survival expert, Zoe, a psychic medium, and Ryan, a skeptic and documentary filmmaker. Equipped with advanced gear, they ventured into Blackwood Forest under the pale light of a full moon. The moment they crossed into the forest, the air grew heavy, and the familiar silence enveloped them. Evelyn paused. "Stay close," she warned. "This place feeds on fear." Zoe shuddered, clutching a crystal pendant around her neck. "The energy here, it's alive. It's watching us." Hours later, they reached the clearing where the cursed altar stood. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, and the surrounding trees seemed to lean inward as if guarding it. Marcus inspected the area while Ryan set up his camera, muttering, "It's just an old relic. No ghosts here." But as Zoe stepped closer, she froze. Her eyes glazed over, and her voice dropped into a chilling monotone. "They are trapped. Bound to this place. The forest won't let them go." Before anyone could react, the ground trembled, and the shadows began to shift. A deep, inhuman growl echoed through the clearing, and figures began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they seemed like ordinary shadows, but as they moved closer, their forms became clearer, distorted and grotesque. Evelyn gasped as she recognized the faces of the missing hikers, their expressions twisted in agony. "Run!" Marcus shouted, breaking the group's paralysis. They bolted into the forest, but the shadows pursued, their guttural growls growing louder. The forest twisted around them, paths shifting and closing like a living labyrinth. Ryan, separated from the group, stumbled into a small grove where the red light pulsed from the ground. As he raised his camera, a shadow lunged at him, and his screams echoed through the trees. By the time Evelyn and Marcus found him, there was nothing left but his shattered camera and bloodied backpack. "We have to leave," Marcus urged, but Zoe stopped. Her voice trembled as she stared into the darkness. "We can't leave. Not without freeing them." Evelyn hesitated before realizing the truth. The altar wasn't just cursed, it was a prison, binding the souls of those it claimed. Destroying it might be their only chance of escape. The three returned to the clearing, Zoe chanting a protective incantation while Marcus poured accelerant over the stone. As Evelyn lit a match, the shadows swarmed, their screeches deafening. One lunged at Marcus, dragging him into the darkness before he could scream. With no time to grieve, Evelyn threw the match. The altar burst into flames, and the symbols glowed brighter before cracking apart. The shadows writhed, their forms dissipating into the night. A piercing howl filled the air as the forest seemed to shudder, and then, silence. Evelyn and Zoe stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bruised and broken. They never spoke of what happened to Marcus or Ryan. Months later, Blackwood Forest grew quiet again. But hikers who pass too close swear they see faint, glowing symbols in the distance and hear whispers that sound like cries for help. The curse may have been broken, but Blackwood Forest has never let go of its darkness. And it never will. The Cursed Heart of Blackwood Forest, Part 3. A year had passed since Drive. Evelyn Cross and Zoe barely escaped Blackwood Forest. Though the altar had been destroyed, the forest's darkness lingered. Evelyn, haunted by nightmares of the shadows and her lost team, retreated from public life. Zoe, scarred physically and emotionally, refused to speak of the events. But the whispers of Blackwood Forest refused to die. Reports of strange occurrences escalated, unearthly red lights deep in the woods, voices calling out for help, and hikers disappearing without a trace. Some claimed the forest was reclaiming its power. Evelyn knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. This time, she turned to an old colleague, Drive. Nathaniel Kane, a folklore expert who specialized in ancient curses. Nathaniel brought with him a book of forbidden rituals, a tome that detailed a way to permanently sever the forest's connection to the entity that haunted it. Reluctantly, Zoe agreed to join them, feeling a deep responsibility for those still trapped in the forest. Along with two newcomers, ex-military tracker Jason and tech expert Layla, they prepared for a final confrontation. On a moonless night, the team ventured into Blackwood Forest. Evelyn carried the ritual tome, while Layla set up motion sensors and infrared cameras to track any disturbances. Jason led the way, his sharp instincts catching every shift in the oppressive silence. Zoe, pale and trembling, clutched her pendant, whispering, "They're still here. I can feel them." Hours in, the forest grew darker, the air heavier. The team stumbled upon remnants of the broken altar. Its stones were scattered, but faint, glowing symbols had reappeared on the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat. Nathaniel knelt, examining the marks. "The entity isn't bound by the altar anymore," he murmured. "It's spreading." As he spoke, the first attack came. Shadows erupted from the trees, their forms more grotesque than before. They moved faster, their hollow eyes glowing red. Jason fired his rifle, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkness, but the bullets passed through the creatures like smoke. "Stay in the circle," Nathaniel shouted, hurriedly drawing protective symbols around the group with chalk. The shadows hissed, unable to enter, but their presence warped the air. Whispered taunts filled their ears, targeting their deepest fears. One voice rose above the rest, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the forest itself. The ground trembled, and the trees twisted unnaturally. "You cannot break me," it bellowed. "You are mine." Nathaniel began the ritual, chanting in a language long forgotten. The symbols on the ground glowed brighter, and the forest seemed to scream in rage. Zoe fell to her knees, clutching her head as voices of the lost, Daniel, Claire, Victor, and Ryan, echoed in her mind, begging her to help them. Layla's equipment went haywire, screens flickering with distorted images of faces trapped in agony. "They're in the forest," she yelled. "It's feeding on their souls." As the ritual reached its climax, the shadows lunged, breaking through the circle. Jason fought them off with a makeshift torch, but one shadow latched onto him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams faded, leaving the others paralyzed with fear. Nathaniel pressed on, his voice unwavering. The glowing symbols expanded, forming a massive sigil that lit up the forest. A deafening roar erupted as the ground split open, revealing a chasm of swirling darkness. The entity, a massive shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, rose from the depths, its form writhing and monstrous. "You dare defy me," it bellowed, its voice shaking the trees. Evelyn stepped forward, holding the book. "Your time is over," she said, throwing the tome into the chasm. The sigil flared, and the entity let out a bone-chilling scream as it was pulled into the void. The shadows dissipated, and the forest grew eerily still. By dawn, the survivors, Evelyn, Zoe, and Layla, emerged from the forest. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. For the first time in centuries, Blackwood Forest felt free. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Zoe froze. She turned back, staring into the trees. "They're still here," she whispered. Evelyn and Layla exchanged a look but said nothing. The curse was broken, but the souls of the lost remained bound to Blackwood Forest, their whispers a haunting reminder of the darkness that had once ruled the woods. The Cursed Heart of Blackwood Forest, Part 4. The whispers of Blackwood Forest never truly faded. Though the entity was banished, and the forest appeared to return to its natural state, a lingering unease remained. Hikers still reported eerie sensations, sudden chills, faint whispers, and shadows that moved when no one was watching. For Evelyn Cross and Zoe, the nightmare was far from over. Months after the supposed victory, Zoe began having vivid dreams. In them, she wandered the forest, hearing the voices of the lost: Daniel, Claire, Victor, Jason, and Ryan. They called to her, begging for help, their faces twisted in anguish. Each dream ended the same way, with a massive, blackened tree at the forest center, its roots pulsing with crimson light. Zoe couldn't ignore it any longer. She contacted Evelyn, who had spent the months obsessively studying ancient texts. "I think the forest isn't finished with us," Zoe said. Evelyn nodded grimly. "I've been having the same dreams." This time, they brought reinforcements. Tyler, a former ranger with an encyclopedic knowledge of the forest, Carla, an occult expert specializing in spiritual bindings, and Ben, a combat medic. Together, they devised a plan to free the souls trapped in the forest. Evelyn believed the blackened tree in Zoe's dream was the anchor, a final remnant of the entity's power. The team entered Blackwood Forest under the cover of darkness. Unlike their previous expedition, the forest seemed alive. The trees loomed taller, their branches tangled like skeletal hands. The ground beneath their feet felt soft, as if something writhed beneath it. As they moved deeper, the whispers began. Faint at first, they grew louder, taking on familiar voices. "Help us," they cried. Tyler froze as he heard his missing brother's voice among them, a victim of the forest years ago. "No," Evelyn snapped, grabbing his arm. "It's trying to trick you." They reached the heart of the forest just before dawn. There it stood, the blackened tree from Zoe's dreams, its gnarled roots pulsating with a sinister, red glow. Around it, the ground was littered with bones, remnants of those the forest had claimed. Carla stepped forward, placing protective talismans around the group. As they prepared to sever the tree's connection to the forest, the shadows returned. This time, they were more solid, more human. "You left us," one of them whispered, its voice matching Jason's. The shadows circled the group, their forms flickering between human and monstrous. The air grew colder as the tree began to creak and groan. Evelyn opened her book, reciting the binding ritual while Carla spread salt around the roots. Tyler and Ben fended off the shadows with torches, their flickering flames barely holding them back. Suddenly, the ground split open, and a massive root shot up, impaling Carla before anyone could react. She gasped, her blood soaking the soil as the shadows closed in. "Finish it," she choked before collapsing. Evelyn's voice faltered, but Zoe stepped forward, taking the book. "I can do this," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger as the sigils on the tree began to glow. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. The tree shuddered violently, its branches reaching for the sky before splitting apart. A deafening roar filled the forest as a bright light erupted from its core, blinding them. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The blackened tree was gone, its remains reduced to ash. The oppressive energy that had hung over Blackwood Forest for centuries was lifted. But the cost was high. Carla was gone, and Tyler was injured. Evelyn, Zoe, and Ben stood in the clearing, staring at the ashes. The voices of the lost were gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. As they left the forest, Zoe glanced back one last time. For the first time in her life, the forest seemed peaceful. "It's over," she whispered, though a part of her wasn't sure if she believed it. Blackwood Forest remained, its mysteries buried, its curse broken. But some say on the darkest nights, if you stand at the edge of the woods, you can still hear faint whispers, a reminder of those who were never found. The Cursed Heart of Blackwood Forest, Final Reckoning. Blackwood Forest had grown darker with time. What once seemed like faint whispers had evolved into full-blown terror. Villagers nearby claimed to see glowing eyes in the trees and hear chilling screams at night. The forest was no longer just haunted, it was becoming a portal to something far worse. Evelyn Cross knew it was time to end it once and for all. She contacted a group of specialists: Ethan, a hardened exorcist who had faced demonic forces; Lara, a pyrotechnics expert ready to burn the forest down if needed; Marcus, a combat veteran; and Sophia, a spiritualist who could communicate with the dead. Zoe, now stronger and determined, joined them as well. Their goal was clear: destroy the forest's dark heart and banish the spirits forever. Evelyn had discovered an ancient ritual, a dangerous one that required extreme precision and would come at great risk. As they entered the forest, it was clear this was no ordinary haunting. The air was icy, and the trees seemed alive, their branches twisting toward the group like claws. A thick mist surrounded them, muting their voices and blocking the moonlight. Sophia stopped suddenly. "They're here," she whispered. Around them, faint figures emerged from the mist, ghostly apparitions with hollow eyes and twisted faces. They moaned and reached out, their touch freezing cold. "Keep moving," Marcus barked, firing a flare into the air to scatter the ghosts. They pressed on, guided by Evelyn's map, until they reached the heart of the forest. There, they saw it, a massive, blackened tree pulsating with a malevolent red glow, its roots digging deep into the earth. Around it, the spirits of the forest circled like a swarm, their screams deafening. The team knew this was the source of the curse. Ethan began the exorcism, chanting ancient incantations while Sophia tried to communicate with the trapped souls. "They're angry," she said, her voice shaking. "They don't want to go, they want revenge." The spirits surged, attacking with a ferocity none of them expected. Marcus fought them off, his weapons barely slowing them down. Lara threw incendiary grenades, setting nearby trees ablaze to create a barrier. But the spirits kept coming. Evelyn and Zoe focused on the ritual, pouring salt and holy water around the tree. As Evelyn recited the final verse, the ground began to quake. The tree let out an unearthly howl, its glow intensifying. Suddenly, a massive shadow emerged from the tree, a monstrous, grotesque entity formed from the combined rage of the spirits. "You cannot defeat us," it roared, its voice shaking the earth. The team attacked with everything they had. Lara detonated explosives at the tree's base, weakening it. Ethan pressed on with his chants, his voice growing louder as the entity tried to silence him. Marcus, injured but relentless, fired round after round at the shadow, forcing it back. Sophia screamed as the spirits surrounded her, their claws raking at her skin. "Go," she yelled, sacrificing herself to buy the others time. Her death created a ripple of energy, momentarily stunning the entity. Evelyn and Zoe seized the moment. Together, they poured the last of the holy water into the tree's core and lit a sacred fire. The flames consumed the tree, and the entity howled in agony. Ethan raised his crucifix and shouted the final words of the exorcism. The entity writhed, its form breaking apart as the fire spread. One by one, the spirits disintegrated, their screams fading into silence. When the flames died down, all that remained was ash. The oppressive energy that had suffocated the forest was gone. The air felt lighter, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The survivors, Evelyn, Zoe, Ethan, Lara, and Marcus, emerged from the forest, battered but alive. They had ended the curse, but at great cost. Sophia's sacrifice and the horrors they endured would haunt them forever. Blackwood Forest, now a charred ruin, was finally free of its darkness. For the first time in centuries, it was silent, not with malice but with peace. The spirits were gone, and the portal to their malevolent world was sealed forever. But as the group walked away, a single ember glowed faintly among the ashes, flickering for. If you all are on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it and hope you enjoy my videos. Thank you. So let's do it. The most horror story. It was the sound that first unsettled me. Not a scream, not a crash, but a slow, deliberate knocking. 3 knocks, each followed by an unnerving silence. I was alone, miles from any neighbor, nestled in a cottage that had been untouched for years. The wind outside howled like a wailing ghost, but the knocking persisted, louder now, almost like a rhythm. At first, I thought it was the wind, perhaps a branch tapping against the window. But no, this was different. These were distinct knocks, the kind you couldn't ignore. I stood frozen by the door, not sure whether to answer or retreat. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I lived alone. The nearest town was hours away, and even if someone did stumble across my cottage, who would be out here at this hour? I felt my pulse quicken, each beat louder than the last. I tried to steady myself, my hand hovering over the door's handle, but a strange unease held me still. Another knock, this time softer, as if it were testing my resolve. Then, silence again. I could feel the cold creeping in, not from outside, but from within, deep in my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my breath came out in shallow, quick gasps. The knocking hadn't stopped. It had been there all along, just waiting for me to acknowledge it. I glanced through the small window beside the door, but all I saw was the thick mist that had settled around the cottage. The darkness beyond it was all-consuming, like a void that refused to let go. I pulled my sweater tighter, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. The silence now felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't know what that something was, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something was wrong. My hand finally gripped the doorknob, and with one slow turn, I opened the door. Nothing. Just the fog, thick and dense, swallowing the space in front of me. Yet the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Mind. The cold air wrapped itself around me as I stepped cautiously out onto the porch, the mist clinging to my skin like a second layer. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from every side. The knocking had stopped, but the unease lingered, thick and suffocating. My eyes scanned the yard, the dark shapes of trees lining the edge of the property. Nothing moved, no signs of life. It was as if the world had simply paused, holding its breath along with me. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place did little to ease the growing knot in my stomach. I'd been living here for months, in this remote cottage far from the chaos of the world. It had been my escape, away from the noise of the city, away from the things I was trying to forget. But now, that peace was slipping away, replaced by something darker. Something I didn't understand. My name is Ava, and I'd been trying to heal here. My therapist had recommended it after a rough year, a year I didn't like to think about too much. But here, in this lonely cottage, surrounded by the vast, empty woods, I was supposed to find peace. Instead, I found myself growing increasingly aware of the loneliness that pressed in around me at night, of the way the silence became suffocating when the world around me was still. The cottage was charming in its own way, with creaking floorboards and a worn fireplace that seemed to whisper secrets in the stillness. It wasn't much, just a small two-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and windows that rattled with every gust of wind, but it had felt like the perfect place to disappear. But now the cottage felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a trap. I moved into the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaking of the wood as the house settled. There was a single lamp on in the corner, casting a dim, flickering light. I ran my fingers over the cool edge of the counter, my thoughts drifting back to the earlier events. The knocking. The strange unease that had taken root in my chest. I had tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just my imagination, but something didn't sit right. As I turned toward the window, I caught a glimpse of movement in the yard, just a flicker, a shadow moving between the trees. I froze, staring out into the fog. Nothing. It was gone. I exhaled, my breath shaky. I was starting to wonder if I had made a mistake coming here. Was I running from something? Or was I running towards something I wasn't prepared for? The night settled around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to distract myself with the mundane, making tea, checking my phone, flipping through an old book. But the feeling never left. It clung to me, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Suddenly, I heard it again, faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But no, this was something different. It was too clear, too deliberate. Ava. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, my eyes darting around the room. The whisper had come from the hallway. The place where the house was darkest. I tried to dismiss it, surely it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the sound had been too real. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, my feet moved before my mind could catch up, carrying me toward the hallway. My breath quickened as I reached the door to the spare bedroom, where the whisper had seemed to come from. I pushed open the door, half expecting to find something waiting in the shadows. Nothing. The room was empty, bathed in the soft, dull glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. A thin layer of dust coated the floor, and a moth fluttered by the window, its delicate wings beating against the glass. I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of the air pressing in around me again. But then, as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The whisper had been too distinct. Too real. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the kitchen, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. But the cold air seemed to have followed me. It was colder now, much colder than before, like a draft running along the floorboards. I knew I should have gone to bed, tried to sleep off whatever this feeling was. But sleep didn't come easily here, not anymore. Instead, I stood in the middle of the room, trying to gather my thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second growing more and more oppressive. Then came the sound again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate knocks on the door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze. This time, I didn't move. I couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were leaning in closer. The knock came again, louder this time. It was followed by a deep, rasping breath. A sound that wasn't human. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. But there was one thing I knew for sure, the knocking wasn't just some trick of the wind. Something, or someone, was waiting for me at that door. The knocking didn't stop. Each tap on the door sent a jolt of cold fear racing through my veins. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow and quick. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of how long I had been standing here, paralyzed. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then, the whisper again, closer this time. Ava. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice was softer than before, but it had an edge to it now, a hint of malice, a hint of something ancient that I didn't want to understand. I took a slow, steadying breath. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to leave, but my body refused. I knew I needed to get out of here. I had to. But where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, and in my state, I wouldn't make it past the woods. The knock came again, 3 times. My pulse thrummed in my ears. My legs shook as I took a cautious step forward. The door, still closed, still sealed, was the only thing between me and whatever waited outside. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. But I couldn't just stand here either. I glanced toward the window by the door. The fog outside had thickened even more, blanketing everything in a dense, suffocating veil. Through the glass, I saw nothing. No movement, no shape, just a soft, gray blur. Another knock. This time, it wasn't followed by a whisper. Just silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud, heavy and oppressive. My mind screamed again to leave, to do something, anything, but I was rooted in place. I felt the weight of the door, the weight of the house pressing down on me, as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a choice. With a shaky hand, I reached for the doorknob. It was cold against my palm, colder than it should have been. I hesitated, then turned it. The door opened slowly, the creaking sound too loud in the stillness. Outside, there was nothing. No one. Just the thick fog, swallowing the yard, the trees, and everything beyond. I stood in the doorway, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or not seeing. The air smelled of damp earth, but beneath it, there was something else, something metallic. Something that didn't belong. The fog pressed in close, and I felt the temperature drop even further, a sharp chill that sunk deep into my bones. I stood there for a moment, straining my eyes to see anything beyond the mist. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, and I spun around, heart racing. Nothing. The night had swallowed the world whole, leaving only an endless, gray expanse. Then, as if in response, a voice, a whisper, came from the yard, from the trees. Ava. I whipped my head back toward the source of the voice, but again, there was only fog. Only shadows. And in that moment, I knew. I knew something had been here, something was still here, and it wasn't going to stop. I slammed the door shut, the force of it rattling the walls. My pulse was pounding in my ears now, and my hands shook violently. I backed away from the door, breathing hard. But the feeling of being watched, didn't go away. It settled over me like a weight. The whispering continued, barely audible but unmistakable. Ava, we've been waiting. The words curled around me, sinking deep into my chest. I turned and fled from the living room, desperate for any escape from the suffocating atmosphere that pressed in on me from every direction. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. The house was too quiet now. Too still. I reached the kitchen, then the back door. The lock was old, rusted. My hands fumbled as I tried to turn it, my breathing coming in sharp gasps. Finally, it gave way, and I yanked the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fog was even thicker here, swirling in the yard, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. I stepped outside, my feet crunching on the frozen ground. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back, to go inside where it was safe. But the house, the cottage, didn't feel safe anymore. I had to get out. I walked, or stumbled, through the yard, my mind racing. The path ahead was shrouded in fog, the trees towering over me like dark sentinels. The world had narrowed to this, just the muffled crunch of my feet in the grass, the suffocating fog, and the whispers, still faint, still distant, but never fully gone. Ava. The voice was closer now, behind me. No longer a whisper, but a rasping breath. It was like a shadow, slipping between the trees, following me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog. A shape, half seen, standing just ahead of me. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to approach. Ava. The voice was unmistakable now, clear and urgent. It came from the figure, a man, no, not a man. There was something off about him, something wrong. His face was too pale, his eyes too dark. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and his body seemed to sway with the fog, as though he was part of it. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, too loud, too fast. "Come closer," the figure whispered, his voice a rasp, a low, hungry sound. "We've been waiting for you." It wasn't just a whisper anymore. The air itself was thick with it. I could feel it pressing in on me, the fog curling around me like fingers. The world tilted, as if reality itself was bending. And all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by something more powerful than fear. Then, without warning, the figure lunged toward me. I didn't have time to think. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, bolting forward into the thick, suffocating fog. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, like it wasn't real, as if I were running through a dream, or worse, a nightmare. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The figure was still behind me, its footsteps too close, too deliberate. I could feel its presence, as if the fog itself had come alive, swirling in time with my heartbeat. "Ava," the voice, low and distorted, called after me, growing louder, closer, as if the fog was pulling it toward me, forcing it to wrap around my mind like a noose. I couldn't escape it. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how many twists and turns I made through the trees, the figure was always just behind me, lurking in the shadows, never letting me get far enough to outrun it. I burst into a clearing, gasping for air. The fog hung so thick in the air that I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. The trees around me seemed to stretch upward infinitely, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The clearing was eerily silent now, the only sound the frantic thudding of my heart in my chest. But that silence was a lie. It was a silence that pressed against my skull, that whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I turned in a circle, searching for any sign of escape, but the fog closed in tighter, thicker, until I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The only thing that remained was that same, familiar voice. "Ava, we've been waiting for you." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just the voice now, it was everywhere. The sound, the words, the whispers, they were seeping into my very skin. The air seemed to vibrate with them, their presence too loud, too close. The fog swirled faster, moving like an entity of its own, drawing me in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, keeping me trapped here, frozen in the heart of the clearing. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape emerging from the mist. But then, it took form. The figure stepped out of the fog, slowly, deliberately. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, its body bent at strange angles, like a broken marionette. The face, if you could call it a face, was pale and featureless, smooth as though it had never been made. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an endless white expanse where features should have been. But the thing that made my stomach lurch wasn't its appearance, it was the feeling of familiarity, the overwhelming sense that I had seen this thing before. Seen it, or known it. Its long, slender arms reached toward me, its fingers outstretched like claws, dragging through the fog as though it was weaving the very air around it. The sound of its movement was wrong. Too smooth, too fluid, as if it didn't belong to this world. I took a step back, heart hammering. "Who are you?" I gasped, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but it didn't need to. The air around me grew heavier, pressing in, suffocating. A sense of dread unlike anything I had ever known settled in my bones. I felt it then, the deep, unshakable truth that I had been brought here for a reason. I had been chosen. I didn't know how I knew, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. This thing in the fog, was connected to me. To everything. To my past. The figure took another step forward, its motion impossibly smooth. Its fingers brushed the air in front of me, and the world seemed to tremble. Ava, the voice, that same whisper, filled my mind. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was inside me, in my thoughts, in my memories. "You came here looking for peace," the voice murmured. "But there is no peace for you. You were never meant to leave." I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to make sense of the words. But they didn't make sense. They couldn't. Suddenly, a flash of memory hit me, a memory I hadn't thought of in years, buried so deep that I had almost forgotten. It was of a face, my mother's face, pale and lifeless, eyes wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. And then I remembered the house that had once been ours before it had burned down. The fire, the screams, the curse. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. The figure, that terrible, faceless thing, was part of it. It had been waiting for me, waiting for all of us. And now, it was here, in the fog, in the darkness, ready to take me back. My feet scrambled for purchase on the wet earth, but there was no escape. The clearing seemed to close in, the fog thickening, the figure looming over me like a predator about to strike. My vision blurred as the whispers filled my head, drowning out everything else. "Ava," it called again, the sound rising to a cacophony. "You never escaped. You never left." I screamed, but it was swallowed by the fog, the figure's presence suffocating everything. My body jerked, my thoughts splintering into 1,000 pieces. And then, it was quiet. Silent. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dark. The fog was gone. The trees were gone. Everything was gone. I was standing in a dark room. The same room I had left behind. My old bedroom, the one I hadn't seen in years. But it wasn't real. I knew that. The walls were peeling, the window cracked. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering. The air was thick with dust, the remnants of something long forgotten. I heard the sound of breathing behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. "Ava," the voice whispered again, this time soft, almost tender. I knew what would happen next. I would turn around, and I would see it. The thing that had followed me. The thing that had waited for me. But I had already known it wasn't over. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as though I were choking on it. My head spun, dizziness creeping in from the edges of my vision. The dark room, my old bedroom, felt wrong, like an echo of something that was never truly real. The walls seemed to pulse with the slow rhythm of a heartbeat, or was that mine? The flickering light above me cast long, unnatural shadows across the room, stretching and pulling in ways that made no sense. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The whispers, the soft, honeyed voice, still echoed in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. "Ava," it murmured again. It was closer now, too close. "We've been waiting." I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. I could hear it breathing behind me, slow and steady, each inhale too deep, too unnatural. "It's not real," I told myself. "This isn't real." But the trembling in my hands told a different story. The air felt so thick, so oppressive, that every inch of my body screamed to escape. I had to leave. I had to. But as I took a step toward the door, I felt it. A pressure on my chest, a weight that wasn't there before. My limbs felt like they were moving through water, slow and heavy, as though the very room was pushing back against me. Ava, the voice whispered, now just a breath in my ear. You can't leave. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out all sound except the steady, rhythmic breathing behind me. Something had changed. Something was different. My body felt distant, detached from the fear that gripped me. It was as though I was no longer fully here. I wasn't in this room, not truly. I was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Somewhere cold. The room seemed to bend around me, the walls warping and stretching, the shadows dancing like figures in a twisted play. My mind struggled to keep up with what I was seeing. The doorway, the bed, the window, they all blurred, and the only thing that stayed clear was the voice. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an invitation. Ava, it said, sweet and smooth, like a lullaby sung by a distant memory. Come closer. We've been waiting. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the bed. The sheets were tattered, stained with something I didn't want to know. The mattress sagged in the middle, the fabric stretched thin, the smell of rot hanging in the air like something alive. Why are you doing this? I screamed, but no sound came out. My mouth opened, my throat burned, but there was only silence. I stepped closer to the bed, my feet moving as though they weren't mine. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to go back to that place where the fire had started, where it had all begun. The room grew colder. The light flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The whispers stopped, but the absence of sound was worse. It pressed against me, suffocating. I could hear the thudding of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in the silence. Then, slowly, a single word pierced the void. Ava. It was softer now. A breath. A whisper, almost playful. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But it was no use. The voice wasn't in my ears anymore, it was in my mind, in my soul. A tremor ran through me, deep in my bones. And then I saw it. A figure, faint at first, emerging from the corners of my vision, growing clearer, more distinct. It was there, no longer in the fog, but in the darkness of the room, standing at the foot of the bed. That same shape, that same form. The tall, bent figure with its faceless head, its long, crooked arms reaching out toward me. I didn't move. Ava, it said again, its voice now a soft, distorted hum, like it was singing. It's time. Time for what? The question burned through my mind, but I already knew the answer. It wasn't time to leave. It was time to give in. The figure raised one arm, the long, skeletal fingers curling toward me. I couldn't stop it. My body didn't belong to me anymore. It was as though the room had become my body, the air my blood, and the figure my soul. The whispers began again, this time all around me, flooding my senses. There were so many of them now, each one indistinguishable from the other, their words blending into a low, hypnotic chant. I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, to move, to escape, but my body betrayed me. It locked in place, trembling, unable to act. I heard the creak of floorboards. The faintest sound of a door opening. The door. My only way out. But no. The voice. It didn't let me. The pressure in the room intensified, and a burning sensation flooded my chest. You can't leave, the voice hissed. You're already here. You were always here. And then, everything stopped. I opened my eyes. The room was silent again. The figure was gone. The fog was gone. The trees, the clearing, the darkness, they were gone. I stood in the middle of my living room again, the fire crackling in the fireplace, the soft hum of the house around me. Had it all been a dream? I turned to the door, my pulse racing. The knocking was faint, but unmistakable. 3 knocks, followed by silence. It's not over, I realized, my heart sinking. The whispers were still there, lingering in my thoughts, creeping into the corners of my mind. The horror had never left. It had only been waiting for me to come back. The whispers began again. Ava. I froze. The door to my apartment creaked open. 3 knocks. The air was thick again, heavy with the same pressure that had consumed me in that cursed room. The whispers were there, too, swirling in the corners of my mind, soft and maddening. Ava. I turned toward the door, the hairs on my neck standing on end. My heart hammered in my chest as the door opened wider, revealing only darkness beyond. The light from the hallway flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I just stood there, frozen in place, eyes locked on the doorway. My thoughts raced, each one a desperate attempt to make sense of it all. Was this real? Was I still dreaming? But deep down, I knew. I knew this was real. It was the same feeling, the same dread, that had gnawed at me ever since I had stepped foot in that cursed forest. The thing had followed me. The thing had always followed me. Ava. The voice was clearer now, a familiar whisper that carried a strange, comforting warmth. It was the same voice I had heard in that house, in the woods, in the fog. But now, it wasn't just in my mind, it was here, in the apartment, in the room with me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think anymore. The door was open wide now, the darkness beyond beckoning, inviting me in. I knew what was waiting there, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. My feet moved as though they were not my own, carrying me forward with a slow, inevitable pull. It's not real, I told myself again. It can't be. But with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. The whispers grew louder, until they drowned out everything else. There was no escape, no turning back. I had walked into this nightmare, and now it was pulling me deeper. The apartment was gone. The walls began to blur, the furniture warping and stretching like melted wax. I was back in the same room where it had all started. The fire, the screams, the figure. It was standing in the corner again, that twisted, faceless thing. Its long, skeletal arms reached out toward me, its empty gaze locking onto mine, its presence pulling me into the dark. "You've come back," the voice said, only this time, it was not just a whisper. It was a promise. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. The figure stepped forward, its feet dragging along the floor, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, merging into a single, unified voice that rattled the very core of my being. "Ava," it called again. "You never left." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body was frozen, my legs refusing to obey, my throat locked tight with terror. The figure was inches from me now. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, could feel the darkness closing in around me. The room shifted again, and I was back in that clearing, the fog swirling around me. The trees loomed, the air thick with an unnatural weight. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, I'm not." But the words didn't matter. They never had. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of electricity through me. My skin burned, my heart raced, and I could feel myself slipping away. "Ava," it whispered one last time, its voice now soft, tender, as if it were comforting me. "You are ours." Suddenly, everything went dark. The fog, the whispers, the figure, they were all gone, and I was alone in the void. But even in the darkness, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It was with me now. It had always been with me. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, my chest heaving, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to me. The room was dark, still, silent, but it felt wrong. The air was too heavy, too thick. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though they were alive. I glanced around, heart pounding. The knocking hadn't stopped. 3 knocks. They came from the door. The sound was the same as before, slow and deliberate, but now it was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that filled the room. The same voice. The same feeling of suffocating dread. "It's not real. It can't be." But as I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, I knew it was. The whispers were louder now, too close, too insistent. "Ava," they breathed. I stumbled toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was open the door. When I did, I saw it. The figure stood there, its faceless gaze locked onto mine. It had followed me here. To this apartment. To this place. "You came back," it whispered, its voice low and final. "You never left." The door slammed shut behind me. In this resolution, Ava's fate is sealed. She wakes up, but the nightmare follows her, pulling her back into the darkness. The twist at the end reveals that no matter where she goes, the entity is with her, and the horrors she experienced are never truly over. The whispers, the figure, it was always part of her past, and now, it will always be a part of her future. This leaves the listener with a chilling uncertainty, questioning whether Ava will ever escape or if the horrors will continue to haunt her forever.